I grew up in Texas, and if you've ever driven through the state, you know how endless the highways feel at night. Miles of flat land, oil rigs blinking red in the distance, and not a single building for what feels like forever. It's the kind of place where silence becomes louder than sound, and your headlights are the only thing reminding you that you still exist. I'd always heard ghost stories from old-timers in my town, tales about abandoned ranches, ghost towns swallowed by dust, and cursed highways where people vanish without a trace. But I never thought I'd be the one telling a story people whisper about years later. It happened in the summer of 2016. I was driving back from San Antonio after visiting my cousin, heading north on Highway 281 toward Blanco. It was late, close to midnight, and the road was nearly empty except for the occasional truck. The moon was thin that night, and the only real light came from my high beam slicing through the darkness. I was tired, running on gas station coffee and an energy drink when I saw her. She was standing on the side of the road right under one of those old wooden signs pointing toward Johnson City. A girl, maybe in her 20s, with long dark hair that fell over her shoulders, wearing a white dress that seemed out of place, like something you'd see at a Sunday church service in the 1960s. She wasn't waving, just standing perfectly still, her face turned toward me as I slowed down. I don't know what possessed me to stop. Maybe it was guilt. What kind of person leaves someone stranded on a highway at midnight? Or maybe it was curiosity. Whatever it was, I pulled over, rolled down the window, and asked if she needed a ride. She nodded silently and got into the passenger seat without saying a word. Her dress brushed against my arm as she settled in, and the air in the car turned cold, unreasonably cold for a Texas summer. I thought maybe it was just me, nerves kicking in, but I turned down the AC anyway. She finally spoke after about a minute, her voice soft, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. She said her name was Maria, and she was heading north toward Marble Falls. Something about the way she said it unsettled me. Her accent wasn't local. It sounded older, almost formal, like the way my grandmother used to talk. Still, I shrugged it off and kept driving, making small talk while she answered with short, vague responses. But there was one thing that stuck with me. She kept asking about the time. Every 10 minutes, she'd glance at my dashboard clock and ask, "It's not too late, is it?" Around 12:45 a.m., we passed through a stretch of road with no lights, no signs, just pure darkness. I glanced at her, maybe to reassure myself she was real, but my stomach dropped. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring straight ahead, her eyes wide, like she was watching something I couldn't see. I followed her gaze, but there was nothing there, just the road, stretching into black. Then she spoke again, this time more urgent. "Can you drive faster? Please, he'll catch up." I felt my throat tighten. "Who?" I asked, but she didn't answer. Instead, she pressed herself back against the seat, her hands clutching her dress like she was bracing for impact. My heart was pounding, and even though my rational brain told me this was just some weird, possibly unstable hitchhiker, I couldn't shake the icy dread crawling up my spine. Still, I pressed on, pushing the car faster. The road twisted slightly, and for a moment I thought I saw headlights in the rearview mirror. 2 faint lights in the distance, far too close for comfort. Relief washed over me. Maybe it was just another driver, but Maria's reaction made my blood run cold. She whispered almost to herself, "He found me again." By now my nerves were shot. I told myself maybe she had an abusive ex or something, someone who had been following her. It wasn't impossible. But before I could piece together a plan, she reached out and grabbed my wrist. Her grip was freezing cold, and she leaned close, whispering in a voice that barely felt human anymore. "Don't stop. No matter what you see, don't stop." And then it happened. A figure appeared in the road ahead, a man tall and broad-shouldered wearing a hat that shadowed his face. He was standing dead center on Highway 281, staring straight into my headlights. I slammed on the brakes instinctively, but Maria screamed, "Don't stop!" Her voice wasn't soft anymore. It was sharp, commanding, almost desperate. Against every instinct I had, I swerved hard to the right, narrowly missing the figure. My tires screeched, the car shook, and for a split second, I thought I was going to flip. When I finally got the car under control and looked back in the mirror, there was nothing there. No man. No headlights behind me. Nothing but the endless black road. I turned to Maria, heart pounding out of my chest, but the passenger seat was empty. The door hadn't opened. The seatbelt was still fastened. She was just gone. I drove the rest of the way home in silence, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles ached. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat there for a long time trying to convince myself it was exhaustion, a hallucination brought on by too much caffeine and too little sleep. But then I noticed something. On the passenger seat where she'd been sitting, there was a folded piece of cloth, white, thin, and old, like part of a dress, and stitched into the corner in delicate faded thread was a name, Maria Delgado, 1963. The next day I couldn't resist. I went online and started digging, searching for anything about a Maria Delgado in Texas. It didn't take long to find an old newspaper clipping from Blanco County, dated July 1963. A young woman named Maria Delgado had been killed on Highway 281, struck by a truck while walking home late at night after her car broke down. Witnesses claimed she'd been fleeing from someone chasing her. My blood ran cold as I stared at her photo in the article. Same hair, same face, same dress. But what chilled me the most wasn't the fact that I'd picked up a ghost. It was the last line of the article, a statement from the truck driver who swore he saw a man standing in the road, wearing a wide-brimmed hat just before the accident. I've driven that highway dozens of times since, but I've never stopped for anyone again. Not in Texas, not anywhere. And yet, sometimes, when the road is dark and the clock ticks past midnight, I catch myself glancing at the passenger seat, half expecting her to be sitting there again, whispering that terrible warning. Don't stop, no matter what you see. I've lived in Texas my whole life, and if there's one thing you learn early, it's that the land here keeps secrets. Miles of open desert, lonely highways, ghost towns that look like they froze in time. But the one place that still keeps me awake at night is a ranch near Marfa, a property I'll never set foot on again no matter how much money someone offered me. I used to think the stories about it were just local folklore. Now, I know better. It started back in 2014 when I was working for a small contracting company. My boss got a call from a man in Houston who had recently inherited an old ranch outside of Marfa. The property had been in his family since the 1920s, but no one had lived there for decades. He wanted it cleared out and appraised before he put it up for sale. Simple job, right? A week of hauling junk, fixing what could be fixed, and reporting back. My boss sent me and two other guys, Ray and Marcus. The drive out there was long and uneventful, but when we finally reached the property, the air felt different. Not just dry desert air. Heavy, still, like the world was holding its breath. The ranch house itself was a 2-story wooden structure, sun-bleached and sagging, surrounded by dead mesquite trees. The windows were boarded up, and the porch looked like it would collapse if you stepped too hard. Hell of a fixer-upper, Ray joked, but nobody laughed. Inside, the place smelled of dust, rot, and something else. Something sour, like meat left out too long. We figured maybe a raccoon or coyote had died somewhere in the walls. The furniture was covered with white sheets, brittle with age, and there were old photographs still hanging in the hallway. Faded black and white pictures of ranch hands, cattle, and a stern-looking man in a wide hat who appeared in nearly every photo. We spent the first day cleaning, hauling out broken chairs, sweeping up piles of rat droppings, and boarding up holes in the roof. By sunset, we were exhausted, but none of us wanted to admit the house made us uneasy. Instead, we set up cots in the living room, lit a lantern, and cracked open a couple of beers. That night I woke to the sound of boots on the porch. Slow, heavy steps, like someone pacing back and forth. I froze, listening. Ray stirred and whispered, "You hear that?" I nodded, too scared to move. Marcus, half asleep, muttered something about coyotes and rolled over. But coyotes don't wear boots. The next morning, we found fresh boot prints in the dirt outside the porch. Deep prints, like someone had been standing there for hours. But the strangest part, they led up to the porch and then just stopped. No prints leading away. We tried to laugh it off, blaming drifters or ranch hands from neighboring land, but we all knew something was off. Still, we had a job to do, and none of us wanted to look like cowards. On the third day, Marcus found something in the barn. He called us over, pale as a ghost, pointing at the far wall. Carved into the wood over and over were names, dozens of them scratched deep into the planks. Some were old and faded, others looked fresh. At the bottom, written larger than the rest, was a name none of us recognized: Delgado. It struck me because it wasn't common to see Spanish surnames carved into ranch walls from that era, especially in this part of Texas. But what really got under my skin was the fact that the last name, Delgado, was carved so deeply, the wood around it splintered. Whoever wrote it must have done it with force, maybe even rage. That night, it was my turn to stand watch, just in case someone really was prowling around. Around 2 a.m., the lantern flickered and went out, leaving me in near total darkness. I tried to relight it, but my hands shook too much. That's when I heard it. Boots. Again. This time, inside the house. The sound came from upstairs, slow and deliberate, crossing the floorboards above me. I wanted to wake Ray and Marcus, but something in me froze. I just sat there in the dark, gripping my flashlight like a weapon, praying the noise would stop. But it didn't. It came closer, step by step, until it sounded like someone was standing right at the top of the stairs. I finally snapped and shined my flashlight toward the staircase. Nothing. Empty. But the air was ice cold, my breath fogging in front of me. I swore I heard whispering then, low, angry words I couldn't understand. Spanish, maybe. When morning came, I told Ray and Marcus. They didn't laugh. They just nodded grimly and admitted they'd both heard similar things the nights before. Boots, voices, the creak of someone moving through the house. We should have left right then. But we didn't. That evening, we decided to check the attic. The hatch was nailed shut, which was strange, considering the rest of the house was just left to rot. We pried it open, coughing as dust poured down. Inside, the attic was small, barely tall enough to crouch, and in the center, beneath a thick layer of dust, was a trunk. It took all three of us to drag it out, and when we finally got it open, the smell hit us like a punch. Inside were bones. Dozens of them. Animal bones mostly, but mixed in were things that were unmistakably human. A skull with teeth still intact, a child's femur, and folded neatly at the very bottom, a stained white dress. Marcus vomited right there. Ray backed away, muttering prayers under his breath. I just stared, numb, because I realized something. The name carved into the barn, Delgado, was the same name I'd seen years earlier in an article about a woman who died on Highway 281. The same one people whispered about when they talked of the Marfa lights and strange happenings in the desert. That night, none of us slept. We stayed outside by the truck, refusing to go back in the house, but sometime after midnight, the lights of Marfa appeared on the horizon. Strange orbs dancing in the distance, shifting colors, weaving through the desert air. We watched in silence, all three of us, too terrified to speak. And then from the porch of the ranch came the sound of boots again. This time faster, angry, pacing. We left before sunrise, didn't bother packing the cots or tools. When we told our boss, he laughed and said we must have gotten into the local whiskey. But none of us ever returned to finish the job, and the ranch was eventually abandoned again. 2 years later, I heard the new owner had vanished without a trace. His truck was found on the property, door wide open, but no sign of him. The only clue? Fresh boot prints leading from the porch into the desert. That stopped suddenly, as if whoever left them had simply disappeared. I don't know what's tied to that ranch. Maybe it's the land. Maybe it's the man in those old photos, the one with the hat. Or maybe it's Maria Delgado herself, doomed to wander both highway and ranch forever. But I do know this. If you ever find yourself near Marfa, and someone dares you to check out the abandoned ranch, don't. The land remembers. The boots are still pacing, and some names are carved too deep to ever fade. I worked oil rigs for nearly 15 years in Texas. Most people don't realize how dangerous the job is, or how lonely it can feel out there. Endless flatlands, a horizon that swallows the sun, and rigs that look like giant mechanical beasts clawing at the earth. I've seen my share of accidents, fires, and near deaths, but there's one job site I'll never talk about openly. Not to my family, not to my co-workers. It's the rig outside Odessa, the one they said was decommissioned decades ago. Back in 2011, I was working with a skeleton crew sent to inspect old oil wells that were supposedly capped. The company didn't want liability issues if kids or hunters stumbled across unstable equipment. It was boring work most of the time. Check the pressure gauges, log the numbers, move on. But one of the sites wasn't on the official map. Our supervisor called it Site Delta and gave us strict instructions. Do not stay past sundown. He didn't explain why, just repeated that line like it was company policy. Naturally, we laughed about it. Oil guys don't scare easily. But when we pulled up to the site, the mood shifted. The rig wasn't rusted and abandoned like the others. It was standing tall, gears creaking, pipes groaning, almost alive. And here's the thing. It was running. Not at full capacity, but moving, pumping, even though it had supposedly been shut down in the late 80s. No power lines fed into it, no generators. Yet the machinery moved, steady and rhythmic, like a giant heart still beating underground. Ray, one of the older guys, swore under his breath. This ain't right. Nothing runs that long without maintenance. But we had orders, so we set up camp nearby, planning to log readings overnight and leave at dawn. The first strange thing happened around midnight. I was on watch, sitting in the truck with the radio on low. Out by the rig, the shadows seemed off. The machinery groaned louder than before, and for a second I thought I saw someone moving among the gears. A worker in a hard hat, walking slow, carrying a wrench. Relief washed over me at first. Maybe we weren't alone. Maybe maintenance crews really had been sent out. But when I stepped closer, flashlight in hand, the figure vanished. I convinced myself I was overtired. But when I got back in the truck, the radio had changed stations. Static. And beneath the static, a voice whispering. Low, urgent, repeating a phrase I couldn't make out. The next morning, we checked the gauges. The pressure levels were perfect, too perfect. Every number was exact, identical to the log entries left by crews in the 80s, like time had frozen for the rig. Ray muttered that he'd heard the same whispers on the radio during his shift, only this time in Spanish, saying something like, below, still below. We should have left then, but orders kept us there one more night. That's when everything spiraled. Marcus, our youngest guy, went missing during his watch. We woke up to find his flashlight lying in the dirt, still on, pointing toward the rig. His boots left a trail of prints that circled the structure and then stopped. No sign of him, no drag marks, just gone. We searched for hours, yelling his name, combing the desert. Nothing. By the time the sun dipped low, we were panicked. Ray said we needed to get out, report it, and never come back. But as we packed up, the rig roared to life. Louder than ever, the ground trembling beneath our feet. The machinery clanged, gears grinding, and for a moment, I thought it was going to collapse. Then we heard it. Marcus's voice. It came from the rig itself, echoing from the pipes, the gears, the very metal. He was screaming, calling our names, begging for help. His voice rose and fell with the rhythm of the machinery, like he was trapped inside. We ran to the rig, searching, shining flashlights, but there was no way a man could be inside those pipes. Still, the voice kept coming, muffled, pained, sometimes laughing in a way that wasn't Marcus at all. Ray broke first. He climbed onto the rig, yelling that he was going to pull Marcus out. I tried to stop him, but he didn't listen. The second his hand touched the main pump, the machinery went still. Silent. Dead. And Ray was gone. No scream, no struggle. One moment he was there, the next he wasn't. The rig stood still, silent in the desert air, as if it had never moved at all. I left. I didn't pack, didn't wait. I drove the truck until dawn, didn't even look in the mirrors. When I got back to headquarters, I told them everything. They looked at me like I was insane. They said Site Delta didn't exist, that my paperwork must have been misfiled, and that Ray and Marcus were transferred to another project. But I know what I saw. Sometimes late at night I turn on my radio just to fill the silence. And sometimes, only sometimes, when the static drifts in, I hear their voices. Marcus begging, Ray shouting, both of them tangled in the gears of that rig that shouldn't exist. I've quit the oil field since then, but I still drive past Odessa sometimes, and in the distance I swear I see a rig moving, its silhouette against the horizon, pumping, always pumping. They say the oil in Texas is endless, buried deep, but I can't help but wonder, what else is down there still below, feeding the machine? When people picture Texas, they usually think of deserts, wide-open ranches, or the flat highways stretching out forever. But East Texas is different. It's thick with forests, towering pines that blot out the sun, winding trails that all look the same, and shadows that seem to move even when there's no wind. Locals call it the Piney Woods, and I swear that place holds things older than the towns built around it. Things that don't like being disturbed. I grew up in Nacogdoches, a college town near the forest edge, and like every kid in East Texas, I grew up hearing stories about the woods. There were legends of the Lantern Man, who lured travelers into the trees with a swinging light. Stories of a witch who cursed the land generations ago. But the one tale that stuck with me was about the thing in the Piney Woods, a creature people described differently depending on who you asked. Some said it looked like a tall man with no face, others swore it was a shadow with antlers, and a few claimed it was the ghost of a Confederate soldier who'd lost his mind and never left the forest. I didn't believe any of it, until the night me and my best friend Daniel decided to camp out there. It was spring of 2015. We were 21, bored, and eager for something to do. Daniel's uncle owned land on the outskirts of the woods, and we figured we'd hike a few miles in, set up camp, drink a few beers, and tell scary stories. Nothing fancy. We packed light, tent, lanterns, matches, and just enough food to last us a night. By the time we set up camp, the sun had dipped low, and the forest swallowed us in shadows. The trees stood close together, their branches creaking in the breeze, and the deeper the darkness got, the quieter the woods became. No crickets, no owls, nothing. Just silence so heavy it pressed against your ears. We tried to brush it off, making jokes, cooking hot dogs over the fire. But when the fire burned low and the shadows stretched long, Daniel leaned in and whispered, "You ever heard about the thing?" I laughed, pretending not to care, but my stomach nodded. He told me his grandmother swore she'd seen it when she was a girl, walking home from church. Said it followed her all the way to her porch, standing at the edge of the trees, too tall to be a man, too thin to be an animal. She never went into the forest again. We laughed it off, but after midnight, strange things started happening. It began with footsteps, soft, deliberate, circling our camp just outside the firelight. We both froze, staring into the dark, but saw nothing. Then came the smell, sharp, metallic, like blood on rust. Daniel swore he saw movement between the trees, tall and thin, just out of the lantern's reach. We decided to stay awake, taking turns keeping watch. Around 2 a.m. it was my shift. The fire had nearly burned out, the lanterns casting weak light. I sat there, half asleep, when I noticed something off. The forest had shifted. The trees looked closer, thicker, like they'd moved in during the night. And then I realized there was a shape standing between them. It was taller than any man I'd ever seen, its body so thin it looked like a shadow stretched too far. And its head, God, its head, was wrong. At first I thought it was antlers, branching out in twisted directions. But then I realized the antlers were moving, curling, almost like arms. I blinked, and it was gone.
At dawn, we packed up and left, laughing nervously at ourselves, swearing we'd just been spooked by shadows. But as we walked back toward the road, Daniel stopped dead. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. At first, I thought it was wind, but then I recognized it. Whistling. A low, steady whistle carrying through the trees. A tune I didn't know, but one that made the hair on my arms stand straight up. We ran the rest of the way. By the time we got back to his uncle's land, the whistling had stopped. We swore never to talk about it again, and for a while I managed to push it out of my head. But 2 weeks later, Daniel disappeared. They said he'd gone hiking alone, somewhere near the woods. Search teams combed the area for days, but they never found a trace. No footprints, no gear, nothing. The sheriff chalked it up to an accident, maybe a fall into one of the ravines, maybe an animal attack. But I knew better. Because 2 nights after he vanished, I woke up in my room to the sound of whistling, the same low tune floating just outside my window. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just lay there, praying it would stop. When I finally worked up the courage to look, the yard was empty, but at the edge of the woods, just where the moonlight cut off, I saw it. Tall, thin, wrong, and swaying, slowly, as if it were keeping time with its own terrible song. Now, years later, I've moved far from Nacogdoches, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear that whistling, and I can't help but wonder, did it follow me out of the piney woods, or am I already standing in its forest
I
and
grew
just
up just
haven't
outside of
realized
Lubbock,
it yet?
Texas, where the cotton fields seem to go on forever and the sunsets bleed red into the horizon. Life there always carried a strange quietness, but in that silence there were whispers of places you weren't supposed to go. Abandoned homes, dry wells, and old churches left to rot after storms tore through the land. One of those places was the Hollow Creek Baptist Church, a small wooden building that had burned halfway to the ground back in the 1960s. People said lightning had struck the steeple during a revival service, killing several parishioners inside. The church was left untouched after that, as if frozen in time, with charred walls and splintered pews still standing against the wind. When I was 19, my cousin Caleb dared me to go inside one night. We had been drinking, sitting on the bed of his truck with the headlights casting long shadows across the field. He said people still heard hymns being sung inside the church even though the roof was half missing, the kind of hymns that sounded like they were coming from throats that hadn't breathed in decades. Of course, I laughed it off, pretending I wasn't scared, but deep down I felt a coldness I couldn't explain. Something about that black silhouette of a building felt alive, like it was waiting for someone foolish enough to enter. The night we decided to go, a storm was rolling in, but we went anyway. The air smelled like wet earth, and flashes of lightning kept illuminating the broken steeple like a warning. We pushed open the door, which groaned so loudly it echoed across the empty fields. Inside, the air was damp, heavy with soot, and it felt colder than outside, almost unnaturally so. The pews were still there, some overturned, some scorched, and in the middle of the aisle, there was a pulpit, cracked in half. What made me pause was the fact that the hymnals, the old leather hymn books, were still lined neatly across the pews, untouched by time, as if someone had placed them there yesterday. As Caleb wandered off to the back, I stood frozen, listening. That's when I heard it, the faintest murmur of a song. It wasn't clear at first, just a hum carried on the wind, but it grew louder until I recognized it. Nearer, my God, to thee. My chest tightened because it didn't sound like one person singing. It sounded like a whole congregation. I looked toward the altar, and for a split second I thought I saw silhouettes, rows of people, their heads bowed, their lips moving in unison. But when lightning flashed through the broken roof, the room was empty. I called out for Caleb, but he didn't answer. My voice seemed swallowed by the walls. I moved toward the back where he had gone, pushing through a half-burned door that led to what must have been the pastor's office. The room was strange, The floor was covered in ash, yet in the middle was a Bible, completely untouched. I leaned down to look closer, and that's when I noticed something scribbled in the margins. The writing wasn't scripture, it was frantic, messy lines. They won't leave. The fire didn't take them. God forgive me, I locked the doors. My stomach dropped. I suddenly remembered what my grandmother had once whispered about that night in the 60s. She said the pastor had panicked during the fire, locking the doors to stop people from fleeing into the storm, believing that faith alone would protect them. Instead, he had trapped them inside. The thought made my skin crawl, and I felt like I wasn't alone in that room anymore. Then I heard Caleb scream. Not a playful yell, not a drunken laugh, an actual scream that ripped through the silence. I bolted back into the main hall, but the moment I stepped out, everything changed. The pews were no longer empty. They were filled with shadowy figures sitting in absolute stillness, all facing the pulpit. My legs froze, but then I saw Caleb. He was on his knees at the altar, his head in his hands, rocking back and forth like he was in some kind of trance. "Caleb!" I shouted, but he didn't move. The congregation began to hum again, louder this time, and with every note the air seemed to press heavier against my chest. My ears rang, my vision blurred, and I could feel something pulling me forward, as if urging me to kneel beside him. I fought it, stumbling backward toward the exit, and that's when lightning lit up the church one last time. In that blinding white flash, I saw the pastor standing at the pulpit. His face was burned, half melted, but his eyes were still alive, staring directly at me. I don't remember how I got out. One moment I was inside, and the next I was stumbling through the mud, gasping for air as rain poured down. Caleb wasn't behind me. I waited outside, screaming his name, but he never came. When I finally went back with the sheriff and my uncle the next morning, the church was exactly as it had been. Empty, silent, rotting. No sign of Caleb, no sign of anyone. The sheriff told me Caleb must have run off into the storm, maybe got lost, maybe drowned in one of the flooded gullies. They never found his body. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. That church took him. And the worst part? Sometimes when I drive past Hollow Creek on late nights, I still hear the faint sound of hymns carried on the wind. And if I listen long enough, I can swear I hear Caleb's voice. I travel a lot for work. Sales, mostly, which means I've driven nearly every highway in Texas more times than I can count. After a while, the motels all start to look the same. Faded neon signs, cracked asphalt parking lots, rooms that smell like damp carpet and old cigarette smoke. I thought I had seen it all, until the night I stopped at a rundown place just outside Johnson City on Highway 281. I had been driving for nearly 12 hours straight, too exhausted to care where I slept. The sign out front read, "Rest Easy Motel," in buzzing red letters, though half the bulbs were burned out, so it looked more like Res Emo L. The office door creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, there was an older man behind the counter, wearing a wrinkled white shirt that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. His smile was too wide, his teeth yellow. "One night?" he asked, before I even said a word. His voice was hoarse, like gravel. I nodded, slid my card across the counter, and he handed me a key with a heavy brass tag stamped Room 6. The way he said it, Room 6, it sounded rehearsed, deliberate, like he had been waiting for me to ask for that exact room. When I got inside, the room was ordinary, almost disappointingly so. Beige walls, a rattling AC unit in the window, a TV bolted to the dresser. But there was a smell I couldn't quite place. Not cigarettes, not mildew. Something metallic, sharp, almost like pennies. I ignored it, too tired to care, and collapsed on the bed. But the moment my head hit the pillow, I noticed something strange. The mirror above the dresser wasn't reflecting the room correctly. It showed the same space, but slightly off. The curtains looked drawn in the reflection when I knew they were open. The bedspread in the mirror was a dark maroon, but the one beneath me was pale green. It felt like looking into a version of my room that belonged to someone else entirely. I told myself it was just exhaustion messing with me. I turned off the lamp and tried to sleep. That's when I heard it. The sound of a door opening. Not my door, but the one in the reflection. In the mirror, I saw the door creak wide, and a figure stepped in. My stomach dropped. No one had entered my real room, but in the mirror, someone was there. He was tall, his face blurry like a bad photograph, and he carried something long and sharp in his hand. He walked slowly toward the bed. Toward me. I sat up, heart pounding, but the moment I did, the reflection snapped back to normal. Curtains open, bedspread pale green, no figure. I stayed awake for hours, staring at that mirror, waiting for something else to happen. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted into a restless sleep. Around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of dripping. The AC unit was off. The room was silent except for that steady drip, drip, drip. I looked toward the bathroom thinking maybe the faucet was leaking, but that's when I saw it. The carpet by the bathroom door was wet, dark. The smell of iron filled the air stronger than before. My chest tightened. I forced myself to get up and push the door open. Inside, the sink was dry. The tub, however, was not. It was half full of dark water, so dark I thought it was black until lightning flashed outside and I realized it was red. Blood. Thick, clotted, reeking of rust. My knees nearly buckled. And then I saw something else. The shape of a face just beneath the surface, eyes open, staring at me from under the water. I staggered back, slamming the door shut. Panicked, I grabbed my bag and bolted for the exit. But when I yanked the door open, I froze. The parking lot wasn't outside. Instead, there was another hallway. Narrow, dimly lit, lined with doors identical to mine. I stumbled out, confused, my mind screaming that this wasn't possible. I had parked my car right outside, I had seen it, but now it was gone. All that stretched before me was this endless, suffocating corridor. I ran down it, pounding on doors as I passed, but no one answered. Every brass tag said room 6. Every door was the same. I finally stopped, out of breath, and glanced behind me. That's when I realized something terrifying. The old man from the office was standing at the far end of the hall, just watching me. His grin stretched wider than humanly possible, teeth glinting in the flickering light. He didn't move, but somehow I knew. If I stood there a second longer, he would. I sprinted, every muscle screaming, and slammed through one of the doors at random. When I stumbled inside, I collapsed to the floor, shaking. To my horror, it was my room again. Same AC unit, same pale green bedspread, same mirror. And in that mirror, the tall, blurry figure was waiting at the foot of the bed holding that long, sharp object. I don't remember leaving. All I know is that I woke up in my car the next morning, parked in front of the motel. The sun was up, the neon sign buzzing faintly in the daylight. For a second, I convinced myself it was all a dream. But when I looked at the motel, something chilled me to my core. The building was boarded up, windows shattered, roof collapsing. It had clearly been abandoned for years. And yet, when I looked down at the passenger seat, the brass key to room 6 was still in my hand. I've never driven that stretch of Highway 281 again. And sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I still see that endless hallway stretching out before me, and the old man waiting at the end, a place where the land is flat, the horizon endless, and the oil fields stretch as far as the eye can see. Out there, it feels like time itself slows down, the rigs pumping like mechanical beasts against the backdrop of the Texas sky. My father worked the rigs his whole life, and when I was old enough, I followed in his footsteps. Night shifts were always the worst. The landscape looked alien in the dark, just skeletal frames of machinery creaking and groaning, their steady rhythm almost hypnotic. But one particular night in the mid-2000s still haunts me to this day. We were working the northern fields, an isolated patch that didn't see much activity anymore. My partner Vince and I were assigned to check on a pump jack that had been malfunctioning. We drove out in the company truck, headlights slicing through the darkness, until we reached the lonely rig. The night air was heavy with the smell of crude oil, and the sound of metal grinding filled the silence. Everything felt unnervingly still, even for the oil fields. As Vince set to work tightening bolts, I lit a cigarette and wandered a bit. That's when I noticed something strange. Across the barren lot, near the edge where the floodlights didn't quite reach, there was a shadow. At first, I thought it was just another piece of machinery, but as I squinted, I realized it was shaped like a person. Tall. Too tall. Easily 7 or 8 feet, standing perfectly still. "Hey, you see that?" I asked Vince, pointing. He glanced over, shrugged, and said it was probably a worker from another shift. But I knew better. There weren't supposed to be any other crews out there. And besides, no human being was that tall. We got back to work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow was watching us. Every time I looked over, it seemed closer, though I never saw it move. One minute it was near the tree line, the next it was just beyond the floodlights, its head bent slightly as though studying us. My cigarette burned down to the filter without me taking a drag. Vince started to get nervous too. He kept glancing over his shoulder, muttering under his breath. Finally he said, "Let's just finish and get the hell out of here." We packed up fast, but when we climbed into the truck, something was off. The air inside was freezing, our breath fogging the windows even though it was late summer. I turned the key, and the engine roared to life. Relief washed over me until the headlights flicked on. That's when we saw it. The figure was standing directly in front of the truck, impossibly close, its arms stretched down almost to its knees. Its skin, if you could even call it that, was black and slick, like it was coated in oil. But the worst part? Its face, or the absence of one. There was nothing but a gaping hole where the head should have been, darkness spilling outward like smoke. Vince screamed. I slammed the truck in reverse and floored it, gravel spraying as we tore backward. But the figure didn't move. It didn't need to. As we backed up, the floodlights went out, one by one, until we were plunged into total blackness. Only the weak glow of the dashboard lit our terrified faces. We didn't stop driving until we hit the main road. Neither of us spoke for the entire ride back. When we finally returned to the yard and reported the pump jack, the supervisor just frowned. "Strange," he muttered. "That rig's been decommissioned for years. Shouldn't have been running in the first place." Vince and I exchanged a look, but neither of us dared say what we saw. Still, the nightmares came. For weeks afterward, I'd wake in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, convinced something was standing in the corner of my room. And Vince? He quit a month later, packed up, left Texas, and never came back. As for me, I stayed, but I never worked nights again. And sometimes when I drive past the fields, I swear I see it. The shadow, tall and motionless, standing just beyond the reach of the floodlights. Watching, always watching. Terlingua, Texas, is a place that feels abandoned even when it isn't. The desert stretches endlessly in every direction, and the old mining town looks like it's been frozen in the 1920s. Most people come for the hot springs or the stargazing, but I grew up hearing rumors about families who lived out there and disappeared without a trace. I never believed them, until I met the Johnsons. It was the summer of 2016 when I first heard about them. I was working for a small delivery company, driving supplies to remote desert towns. The Johnson family, Mark, his wife Lisa, and their 2 kids, Abby and Dylan, had recently moved into an old homestead outside Terlingua. Everyone in town whispered that the house had a dark history. Previous occupants had vanished, leaving doors wide open and meals still on the table. Nobody could explain it. The Johnsons didn't seem to care. They wanted isolation, privacy, and the eerie charm of the desert. I delivered a crate of bottled water to their house one afternoon. Mark was polite, Lisa quiet but friendly, and the kids shy. The house looked normal enough from the outside, though the paint was peeling, and the windows had an odd reflective tint, almost like mirrors turned inward. Inside, though, something felt wrong. The walls were thick with dust, and a strange hum seemed to resonate through the floorboards. The kids kept glancing at the corners of the room, eyes wide, as if something was watching them. I chalked it up to imagination. Kids in the desert tend to be superstitious, but something about the air made my skin crawl. I returned a week later with another delivery. The house was eerily quiet. Mark greeted me at the door, but Lisa and the kids were nowhere to be seen. I asked where they were, and he smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Out for a walk," he said. "They like the desert mornings." I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was lying. Over the next month, I delivered to their house several times. Each time, I noticed strange things. The kids seemed to shrink slightly with every visit, their voices higher-pitched, almost too light. Objects in the house would move between visits. The same bowl of fruit I'd seen on the table would be on the counter the next day, or a chair would face a different wall. And then there was the humming. Low, constant, like something vibrating from beneath the floorboards. Sometimes I thought it was machinery, other times, something else, something alive. The night I finally understood what was happening, I was returning from a late delivery when my truck broke down about a mile from the Johnson house. I had no cell service and no flashlight. I decided to walk. As I approached the homestead, I saw lights flickering inside. Curious and worried, I crept closer. The front door was wide open. Inside, the air was thick with that metallic humming smell I had noticed before. The children were there, Abby and Dylan, but they weren't playing. They were kneeling in the middle of the living room, heads down, swaying gently as if in a trance. Lisa stood behind them, her eyes closed, muttering words I didn't understand. Mark was at the back, holding a small lantern that cast eerie shadows across the walls, and then I saw it. A shape emerged from the corner of the room where shadows pooled unnaturally. It was tall, thin, with elongated limbs that bent in impossible angles. Its head was featureless, smooth and black, yet somehow radiating intelligence. The humming intensified. It wasn't coming from the house, it was coming from the thing itself. Mark turned and saw me. "You shouldn't be here," he said, calm, almost welcoming. But before I could react, the floorboards beneath me vibrated violently. The humming became a roar. I stumbled back, crashing into a table. When I looked again, the Johnsons were gone. All four of them vanished. The thing turned to me, its long limbs stretching impossibly. I ran out into the desert, tripping over rocks, lungs burning, heart hammering in my chest. Behind me, the homestead fell silent. No lights, no humming. Just the vast, empty desert. I never saw the Johnsons again. I reported it to the authorities, but they found nothing. No footprints, no vehicle, no signs of struggle. Just an abandoned house, sitting under the scorching desert sun like it had never been inhabited. Sometimes when I drive past Terlingua at night, I swear I see the faint glow of that lantern in the distance, and the low humming drifts through the desert air. And I know, somewhere out there, the Johnsons are still kneeling, swaying, waiting for that thing to return. The twist? Years later, I discovered that the old mining maps labeled that land not as desert, but as a site of disappearances dating back to the 1800s. Families, travelers, even entire settlements, gone without a trace. The Johnsons were just the latest, and the humming, it wasn't from the house. It was from beneath the earth, from something that has been waiting forever. I don't usually share this story, mostly because whenever I've tried to tell it in person, people look at me like I'm insane, or worse, like I'm just trying to get attention. But I swear to God, everything I'm about to tell you happened exactly the way I remember it. It was the summer of 2011, and I was driving from Los Angeles up to Sacramento for a new job. I had just graduated from college and was eager to start my life fresh, away from the chaos of LA traffic, the endless bills, and the constant reminder that I was one paycheck away from sleeping in my car. The job wasn't glamorous. It was some dull office position, but it was stable, and that was enough for me at the time. The drive started off normal enough. I packed my small Honda Civic with the few belongings I had and set out early in the morning. I planned to reach Sacramento by late evening, maybe stop for food along the way, and check into an affordable motel for the night before reporting to work the next morning. But around Fresno, something strange happened. I remember passing a faded sign on the side of the highway that said, "The Silver Pines Motel, next exit." The name stuck out because I had been looking for a cheap motel and I thought maybe this was some old roadside gem still clinging to life. I don't know what came over me, but something about that sign felt magnetic. It didn't look like a regular advertisement. The paint was peeling and the metal frame was bent in places like it hadn't been maintained in decades. Yet the words were still oddly clear in the afternoon sun. I convinced myself that maybe it was one of those forgotten, old-fashioned places that would have ridiculously cheap rates. So I took the exit. The road that followed was narrow and cracked, weaving between dry fields and a scattering of eucalyptus trees. I drove for what felt like 15 minutes before I saw it, the Silver Pines Motel. It was strange. The parking lot had about 5 cars, though none of them looked newer than the 1980s. The sign out front glowed faintly in neon, though the letters buzzed and flickered like a dying heartbeat. And yet, despite its shabby look, there was this weird aura around the place, like time itself had slowed down, pressing heavily against the air. When I walked into the lobby, a bell above the door chimed, but no one came to the front desk right away. The lobby smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic like rust or dried blood. The wallpaper was peeling, and the overhead fan turned lazily, creaking with every rotation. After what felt like forever, a woman appeared. She was in her 50s, maybe 60s, with hair pinned up in a messy bun and an expressionless face. She didn't ask me anything, didn't smile, just slid a key across the counter and mumbled, "Room 6, cash only." I handed her the $40 I had in my wallet, grateful it was cheap, and took the key. But here's where things began to feel wrong. As I walked to my room, I noticed the other guests. Or rather, I noticed how they didn't move. There was a man sitting in a chair outside his door, staring at the ground. A woman smoking a cigarette leaned against a railing, but the cigarette never seemed to burn down. Their eyes followed me, unblinking, as if I was the first new thing they had seen in years. When I unlocked room 6, I immediately regretted it. The smell hit me first, like old meat left out in the sun. The carpet was dark with stains, the curtains torn, and the bedspread patterned with cigarette burns. But exhaustion got the better of me, and I told myself I'd just crash for a few hours and leave early in the morning. I lay on the bed, fully clothed, and tried to fall asleep. That's when I heard it. The faint sound of footsteps pacing in the room above mine. At first, I didn't think much of it. Motels always had noisy neighbors. But the pacing continued for hours, a steady back-and-forth rhythm, heavy and deliberate. Around midnight, it stopped. I remember sitting up, relieved at the sudden silence, when I heard something else. 3 slow, heavy knocks on my door. I froze. My first thought was that maybe it was the woman from the office, or another guest. But the longer I sat there, the more wrong it felt. The knocks weren't tentative like someone needing help. They were heavy, measured, like a warning. I didn't answer. I didn't even breathe. After what felt like forever, the knocking stopped. I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember is waking up at 3:07 a.m. My phone's screen glowed on the nightstand, but the strange part was, it showed no signal. Not even no service, just a blank void where the bars should have been. Then I heard the pacing again, but this time it wasn't above me. It was inside my room. I sat bolt upright, scanning the darkness. At first I thought my ears were playing tricks on me. But no, the sound of heavy footsteps circled the bed. The air grew ice cold and I could see my breath fogging faintly in the darkness. I reached for my phone's flashlight, turned it on, and there was nothing. Just the same disgusting, rotting room. But the footsteps didn't stop. They grew louder, angrier, as if whatever it was knew I could hear it. I ran. I didn't even grab my bag. I tore out of room 6, sprinted across the lot, and bolted into my car. But here's the thing. I couldn't leave. The road I had driven in on was gone. In its place was nothing but endless fields stretching into the dark, under a moon that seemed far too big, far too close. I drove in circles for what felt like hours, passing the same flickering sign, the same eucalyptus trees, the same crumbling fence. It was like the motel had swallowed me whole. And then, just as suddenly as it began, I woke up. I was in my car, parked outside a different motel, the kind you'd see off any California highway. The Silver Pines was gone. My bag was in the passenger seat, untouched. My phone had full signal again. It was 6:30 a.m., and the sun was just starting to rise. For a moment, I thought maybe it had all been a nightmare. But when I reached Sacramento later that day and unpacked my bag, I found something that didn't belong to me. Folded neatly between my shirts was a room key. A heavy, rusted key with a tarnished brass tag. It read, Room 6, Silver Pines Motel. I grew up in a small desert town in Southern California, the kind of place where the days were long, the nights were cold, and nothing much ever happened unless you counted the occasional high school football game or a fight outside the only bar in town. We didn't have much in the way of excitement, but we did have history. Old mines, abandoned buildings, and desert ruins that reminded you this land had once been fought over, worked to death, and then forgotten. The story I'm about to tell you took place in 2016 when I was 22 and still living at home, trying to save up money to leave. I had a couple of friends, Marcus and Jamie, who were just as bored and restless as me. One Friday night, Jamie came up with the brilliant idea of exploring the old El Dorado mine. Everyone in town knew the stories. The mine had been active in the late 1800s, during one of California's many gold rush frenzies. But by the 1930s, it was abandoned after a string of mysterious deaths. People said the miners had gone mad, fighting each other, seeing things in the dark tunnels, hearing voices that weren't there. Some folks swore the mine was cursed. Others believed it was just a dangerous place with bad air and unstable shafts. But when you're 22, cursed sounds more like an invitation than a warning. So that night, armed with cheap flashlights, a couple bottles of water, and Marcus's old Jeep, we drove out into the desert. The mine wasn't hard to find. It sat at the base of a jagged hill, its entrance nothing more than a yawning black mouth cut into the stone. A rusted chain-link fence surrounded it, but half the fence had collapsed years ago. A faded "Keep Out" sign clung desperately to the wire, its letters barely visible in the moonlight. We parked the Jeep, killed the engine, and for a moment just sat there staring at that dark hole in the earth. I swear even before we stepped inside, the air around the place felt different. Heavier, colder, like it carried a charge. Marcus laughed it off, saying it was just nerves. Jamie joked that we'd find gold and retire by 30. Me? I didn't say much. I just gripped my flashlight tighter and tried not to think about the stories my grandfather used to tell about the miners who had disappeared down there, only for their bodies to be found weeks later, eyes wide open, mouths frozen in silent screams. We ducked through the broken fence and stepped into the mine. The change was immediate. Outside, the desert night had been cool but breathable. Inside, the air was suffocating, damp and stale, like we were breathing in the dust of 1,000 forgotten lungs. Our footsteps echoed off the stone walls, mingling with the steady drip of unseen water. The deeper we went, the narrower the tunnels became. Timber supports, blackened with age, groaned under the weight of the earth. About 20 minutes in, we found our first sign. It was a helmet, old and rusted, lying in the dirt. Beside it was a pickaxe, its handle splintered, the metal head dark with something that didn't look like rust. Jamie picked it up and said, "Bet this was from the last guy who worked here." His voice bounced eerily off the walls, returning to us in strange, distorted echoes. We laughed nervously, but none of us could quite shake the feeling that we weren't alone. At one point, we reached a chamber where the tunnel split into 3 separate shafts. The left tunnel looked unstable, half collapsed. The middle tunnel stretched straight ahead, disappearing into darkness. The right tunnel seemed to slope downward, deeper into the earth. Marcus wanted to go right, but Jamie argued for straight. We settled on the middle, and that's when things started to go wrong. The deeper we went, the more our flashlights seemed to dim, even though the batteries were fresh. The air grew colder, our breaths forming faint mist. Then, without warning, Jamie stopped. He was staring at the wall, his light fixed on something scratched into the stone. When Marcus and I shined our beams there, we saw it too. Words carved deep into the rock. "It sees you." The letters were jagged, desperate, like they had been gouged out with shaking hands. We stared in silence until Marcus forced a laugh and said, "Probably some prank. Kids come out here all the time." But his voice cracked, and I could tell he didn't believe it either. We pressed on, though each step felt heavier than the last. Then, not far from the carving, we heard it, the sound of someone walking behind us. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching on gravel. We spun around, flashlights sweeping the tunnel, but there was no one there. Just endless darkness. Jamie whispered, "Tell me you guys heard that." We nodded. Our nerves were frayed, but none of us wanted to admit we were scared enough to leave. Then came the shadows. At first I thought it was a trick of the light. My beam flickered across the tunnel wall, and for an instant I saw a figure standing there. Tall, lean, its face hidden in the dark. When I blinked, it was gone. Marcus cursed under his breath. He'd seen it too. Jamie insisted we keep moving, said we'd just scare ourselves worse if we stayed in one spot. So we walked. But the deeper we went, the louder the footsteps grew. Sometimes they echoed from behind us, sometimes ahead, sometimes to the side, as if the mine itself was alive, shifting, playing tricks with sound. My stomach churned with dread, and I remember thinking, this isn't right. We shouldn't be here. Finally, we reached a dead end. The tunnel just stopped, the stone wall rough and uneven. That's when we noticed something strange. In the dirt at our feet were 3 sets of footprints. Not just ours, these were deeper, older, as though someone else had stood there not long ago. And beside them was a 4th set. Larger, heavier, leading directly into the wall. Marcus swore and stepped back. Jamie bent down, tracing the prints with his hand. That's when the wall began to move. Slowly, impossibly, the stone shifted, and out of it stepped the shadow we'd seen earlier. It wasn't human. Not exactly. Its body was tall, unnaturally thin, its arms far too long. Its face was nothing but a smooth void, darker than the mine around it. And yet, somehow I felt it staring at us. We ran. God, we ran like our lives depended on it, because they did. The tunnels twisted and warped. Directions no longer made sense. My flashlight flickered, and each time it did, the shadow was closer. Behind us, ahead of us, beside us, it didn't matter. It was everywhere. I don't know how we made it out. One second we were lost. The next we stumbled through the entrance, gasping for air under the pale desert moon. We didn't speak. We didn't look back. We just climbed into Marcus's Jeep and drove until the mine was nothing but a fading memory in the rearview mirror. But here's the part that still haunts me. When I got home and emptied my pockets, I found something I had never picked up. It was a miner's helmet. Old, rusted, with my name carved into the inside. Not my initials. Not some coincidence. My full name, first and last, etched deep into the leather lining, as though it had been waiting for me. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and I'm alone, I hear it again. The slow, steady crunch of footsteps in the dark. I first heard about Harmony, California from a coworker in San Diego who was a bit of a history buff. He mentioned it casually one day during lunch, saying, "You know, there's a whole town on the coast that's practically abandoned, right? Population 18 last I checked." He told me it had once been a thriving dairy community in the late 1800s, but had fallen into ruin after a series of accidents, scandals, and deaths. Supposedly, the town still existed. A tourist oddity now, but rarely anyone actually lived there. Something about the way he described it stuck with me. Like a place frozen in time, clinging to life but never truly alive. I didn't think much of it until a few months later, when I found myself driving north up the Pacific Coast Highway after a bad breakup, just wanting to clear my head. That's when I saw the faded sign, Harmony, Pop. 18. The name felt like a cruel joke. Harmony. But the moment I pulled off the highway and drove into town, I knew something was off. The buildings, an old chapel, a pottery shop, a glass-blowing studio, looked weathered, sun-bleached, and strangely quiet. There were no cars parked, no lights on in the windows, no movement at all. The only sound was the ocean wind howling faintly in the distance, carrying with it the smell of salt and decay. I parked by the chapel and got out, stretching my legs. For a while I wandered aimlessly, peering into shop windows. Dust coated everything, thick enough to suggest no one had been inside for years. Yet the town didn't look entirely dead. There were fresh tire tracks on the road, footprints in the dirt, and in one window, I swore I saw a candle burning faintly. I remember thinking maybe the population count was accurate, that maybe a handful of eccentric artists or hermits still called this place home. As the sun dipped lower, I considered leaving. But then something caught my attention. In the window of the pottery shop was a vase. Ordinary enough at first glance, except when I leaned closer, I realized it wasn't decorated with flowers or patterns. It was painted with faces. Dozens of faces, each one detailed, etched in anguish. They weren't artistic renderings either. They looked real, like someone had captured people mid-scream and immortalized them in clay. I shivered and stepped back. That's when I saw her. A woman standing in the doorway of the chapel across the street. She wore a faded white dress, her long hair whipping in the wind. She didn't move, didn't wave, didn't speak. Just stared at me with an expression I couldn't read. I raised a hand awkwardly, thinking maybe she'd respond, but in the blink of an eye, she was gone. The chapel doors were shut tight. Most people would have left then, but I was curious, maybe too curious. I walked toward the chapel, each step echoing on the cracked pavement. The door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was heavy, suffocating with the smell of wax and mildew. Candles lined the walls, their flames flickering, though I hadn't seen anyone light them. At the far end of the room stood an altar, and on it rested something that made my blood run cold. It was another vase, only this one wasn't painted. It was filled with teeth. Human teeth piled high, some yellowed with age, some fresh and white. I stumbled back, knocking into a pew, and the sound reverberated through the chapel like a thunderclap. That's when I heard it. Whispers. Low, layered voices coming from every direction at once. They weren't speaking English, at least not fully. It was a mix of words, some recognizable, others guttural and alien. My flashlight beam darted across the pews, but there was no one there. I bolted out of the chapel, gasping for air. The town looked different now. The sunlight was gone, replaced by an unnatural twilight that seemed to bleed into the sky, even though my phone said it was only 6:15 p.m. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the buildings, bending at wrong angles. And then I saw them. People. Dozens of them, standing in the streets, silent, still. Their faces looked familiar, horribly familiar, because I'd seen them before. They were the faces from the vase in the pottery shop. I tried to convince myself it was impossible, that my mind was playing tricks. But then, in perfect unison, they all turned their heads toward me. Not their bodies, just their heads, twisting unnaturally like broken dolls. Their mouths opened wide, impossibly wide, and the whispers returned, louder now, forming a horrible chant that rattled in my skull. I ran. I don't even remember which direction, just away from those faces, away from that town. The streets seemed to stretch endlessly, buildings warping, signs blurring. I swear I ran for hours, until suddenly, without warning, I was back at my car. The town behind me was dark, silent, like it had never been alive at all. I didn't stop to question it. I jumped in the car, slammed it into gear, and peeled back onto the highway. My hands shook so badly, I could barely hold the wheel. I drove until I reached Morro Bay, checked into the first motel I saw, and locked the door behind me. For a while, I convinced myself it had been some kind of hallucination, maybe heat stroke or exhaustion. But 2 days later, as I unpacked my bag, I found something inside that didn't belong to me. A small clay vase, crudely made, with one single face painted on it. My own. And when I smashed it in panic, hoping it would shatter into nothing, I discovered something horrifying inside. A tooth, fresh, perfectly intact, and unmistakably mine. I grew up in San Francisco, and for as long as I can remember, the Golden Gate Bridge has been a symbol of home for me. Tourists always see it as this majestic landmark, shining red against the fog. But for locals, it's something different. It's a constant presence looming at the edge of your vision, carrying with it all the stories people don't like to talk about. The suicides, the disappearances, the strange lights seen in the water below. You can ask anyone from the Bay Area, and they'll tell you that the bridge is more than just steel and cables. It's alive in its own way, and I learned that the hard way. Back in 2014, I was in a pretty dark place. My dad had died suddenly, and my relationship had fallen apart shortly after. I used to drive at night just to clear my head, letting the city lights blur past while I tried to forget the weight pressing down on me. One night, I ended up at the north overlook of the Golden Gate. It was late, maybe close to midnight. The fog had rolled in heavy, the kind of fog that swallowed everything whole, so thick that even the bridge's towers were barely visible. I parked, got out, and walked to the railing. For a while, I just stood there staring at the water far below. That's when I noticed something strange. The fog was moving, but not naturally. It swirled in tight circles beneath the bridge, like water spiraling down a drain. And in the center of it, just visible between the shifting clouds, I saw lights. Not from a boat, not from the city. These lights were deep beneath the water, moving slowly, deliberately, like eyes opening in the dark. At first I thought I was hallucinating. Maybe grief was finally breaking me. But then I heard it. A sound that rose up from the depths, vibrating through the steel under my hands. It wasn't a boat horn or the cry of a bird. It was low, guttural, almost like chanting, the kind of sound that seems to bypass your ears and go straight into your bones. I stumbled back, terrified, but something kept me rooted to the spot. The fog thickened, and suddenly, I wasn't alone. A man was standing a few feet away, dressed in clothes that looked decades out of place. Wool coat, wide-brimmed hat, shoes polished to a dull shine. He stared at the water, not at me, and in a hollow voice said, "It always calls the broken ones first." I wanted to run, but I couldn't. My legs felt cemented to the ground. I asked him what he meant, but he didn't answer. He just turned to me slowly, and I swear to God his eyes were black. Not dark, not shadowed. Black. Pits that seemed to stretch forever. Before I could react, he stepped onto the railing and jumped. I screamed, rushed forward, looked down. But there was nothing. No splash, no ripple, no body. Just the swirling fog and those impossible lights beneath the surface. My heart raced, and I bolted back to my car, slamming the door shut like that would somehow protect me. But leaving wasn't so simple. As I pulled out of the overlook, my headlights illuminated something standing in the middle of the road. At first, I thought it was the man again, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't human. It was tall, at least 8 feet, its body twisted and elongated, skin glistening as if wet. Its head was too small for its frame, and its arms hung down nearly to its knees. And in its chest, glowing faintly, were those same lights I had seen under the bridge. I swerved, heart pounding, and the figure vanished into the fog. I drove faster than I ever had in my life, not daring to stop until I was back in the city, surrounded by the false safety of neon lights and crowded streets. For days, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure, heard that sound vibrating through my bones. I tried to convince myself it was stress, exhaustion, anything but real. But then something happened that I still can't explain. A week later, I got a letter in the mail. No return address, no postage stamp, just an envelope sitting on my doorstep. Inside was a single photograph. It was black and white, old, probably from the 1930s when the bridge was still new. It showed a group of construction workers standing on a steel beam, smiling at the camera. But there, in the water beneath them, half hidden in the shadows of the fog, was the same figure I had seen. Tall, distorted, glowing faintly, watching. And scrawled on the back in smeared ink were 4 words that still keep me up at night. It will call again. I've been to Yosemite National Park dozens of times in my life. Growing up in California, it was the go-to place for family camping trips, school hikes, and weekend getaways. Most people see it as one of the most beautiful, peaceful places on Earth. The granite cliffs of El Capitan glowing orange at sunset, the waterfalls crashing down in endless streams, the quiet majesty of the giant sequoias. But Yosemite has another side, one that doesn't make it into postcards. People vanish there, every year, without explanation. Rangers will tell you it's because of the terrain, the weather, or lack of preparation. And maybe sometimes that's true. But I saw something in Yosemite that made me believe otherwise. It happened in the summer of 2019. I'd gone alone, mostly to clear my head after a rough breakup. I set out on the mist trail, planning to hike up to Nevada Fall. The trail was busy at first, crowded with tourists, kids splashing in the river, couples taking selfies. But the higher I climbed, the thinner the crowd became, until it was just me, the roar of the waterfall, and the endless expanse of trees. The air smelled of pine and wet earth, cool mist clinging to my skin. For a while it was peaceful. Then, about halfway up, I noticed someone ahead of me. A man. He was tall, lanky, and wore an old-fashioned brown hiking coat, the kind you'd expect to see in black and white photos of the park from the early 1900s. His backpack was leather, cracked with age, and he carried a walking stick. At first, I thought maybe he was a reenactor, or one of those history buffs who like to dress up for fun. But there was something wrong about him. For one thing, he didn't make a sound. No crunch of gravel under his boots, no rustle of fabric, no heavy breathing from the climb. Just silence. He moved smoothly, too smoothly, as though the trail itself bent to his steps. And though I tried to catch up, the distance between us never seemed to change. After about 10 minutes, he stopped suddenly and turned. I froze. His face was pale, almost gray, and his eyes, they weren't normal. They were blank, washed out, like river stones smoothed by time. He looked at me for what felt like forever, and then, without a word, stepped off the trail and vanished into the trees. I stood there, heart hammering, telling myself I must have imagined it. Maybe he'd just found a side trail I hadn't noticed. But when I went to check, there was nothing, just dense forest, too thick to walk through. No footprints, no broken branches. Nothing. It was as if he'd dissolved into the air. Shaken, I continued up the trail. For a while, everything seemed normal again, but then I started hearing it. Footsteps behind me. Slow, steady, matching my pace. Every time I turned, the trail was empty, yet the sound never stopped. By the time I reached Nevada Fall, I was on edge, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. I sat on a rock to rest, trying to convince myself I was just paranoid. That's when a ranger approached me. He was middle-aged, friendly enough, and asked how my hike was going. I hesitated, then told him about the silent man. His expression changed instantly. The friendliness drained from his face, replaced by something colder, more guarded. "Where did you see him?" he asked. His voice was low, serious. I pointed down the trail. The ranger sighed, muttered something under his breath, then looked me dead in the eye and said, If you see him again, don't follow, don't talk, and whatever you do, don't let him touch you." Before I could ask what he meant, he walked away, disappearing into the crowd of hikers at the overlook. I cut my trip short after that, too unsettled to enjoy myself. I hiked back down, half running, refusing to look behind me even though I could feel eyes on me the whole way. When I finally reached the parking lot and got into my car, I locked the doors immediately. Relief washed over me. I thought I was safe. But safety, I learned, is an illusion. That night, back at my apartment in San Jose, I unpacked my backpack. Buried at the bottom, wedged between my water bottle and first aid kit, was something I hadn't packed. A folded piece of parchment paper, brittle and yellowed with age. My hands shook as I opened it. It was a map of Yosemite, hand-drawn, detailed, every peak and valley carefully sketched. But it didn't look like the park as it is today. Some landmarks were missing, others had different names, and parts of the terrain seemed warped, almost unnatural. And scrawled across the top in faded ink were 4 words: "Follow me next time." I dropped the map, my stomach turning to ice. Because at the bottom of the page, in handwriting that looked fresher than the rest, was my name, written in sharp, precise letters. I burned the map that night, but sometimes when I'm alone, I still hear those footsteps. Slow, steady, silent, and deep down, I know he's still waiting.